this case of Lyanna has shaken France, and many people are very angry about why this happened and how it was allowed to happen in some sense or other. Let's bring in Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary's in London, for more on this. Andrew, great to have you with us, as always. Subject matter, not the kind of fun thing that I can recall talking to you about, of course. It's a very different tone tonight. This case of Lyanna, it really is every parent's nightmare in so many ways. But what's really rubbing salt into the very much open wounds is the way that the investigation was carried out. Apparently the actual prime suspect not spoken to till further down the line in terms of the inquiries made by the police. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it seems, first of all, this is an absolutely horrible case. It's also an active case, and we're talking mainly about the prime suspect rather than someone who's been convicted of this crime. But the person they're naming as the prime suspect is someone that was, accused of this, investigated for similar crimes in the past. And there seems to have been really a delay in the transfer between kind of complaints processed in Toulouse and their kind of transfer to authorities in Auch. And people are saying at the minute that delay, the fact he wasn't questioned for complaints against him in 2025, may well have, created some of the situation which allowed this to happen. That delay in bringing someone in for questioning, and that's really where the big suspicion is coming. When people are angry about the case, is it about delays in, processing complaints for magistrates bringing things to court? Is it about backlogs in the justice system? Is this about underfunding in the justice system? And that's really where we're seeing a lot of this discussion around, underlining the fact that there are these systemic issues clearly around violence against women and girls. We can look back even to the Gisèle Pelicot trial, and you're seeing her kind of really quite stirring testimony of her own bravery against this horrible situation. Again, this really difficult social situation of, endemic violence against women and girls running up against failures in the court system, which seem to be really falling at the door of the Minister of Justice, Gerald Darmanin, who really, I think, has quite a lot of questions to answer about this.
There are many questions, Andrew, many questions indeed that parents and anybody really across the spectrum will be asking. I wonder whether the issue of age of consent has something to do with official attitudes, authority attitudes towards children who go missing, for instance. 15 was imposed as an age of consent just in 2021. Before that, as I understand it, there was a real vagary about sort of what an age of consent represented and how it would be judged, and it all came down to an officer's judgment in a shape or form, which seems very strange. Do you think that has something to do with official attitudes?
It's challenging. I mean, certainly in this case, the main suspect seemingly was fired from working at a high school, but then it was seen that actually there was difficulties around whether something was consensual or not. These were the kind of facts that were being reported. So certainly there seems to have been some slowness in processing this. And certainly there are underlying issues around that. And I think a need to be far more robust in processing crimes that relate to children, but also gender-based crimes as well. Now, that's something we've seen again and again. We've seen members of the Paris Bar calling for the creation of a national office to prosecute crimes that are gender-based violence. We've seen discussions around how this can be, pushed in a much more active direction. Of course, Gerald Darmanin called for a general mobilisation, getting those 70,000 cases awaiting either formal inquiry or dismissal sorted in just over a month. But really, that's part of the problem, I think. Gerald Darmanin has been very active as a Minister of Justice, but it feels, I think, to many people that he issues these circulars. Every current event becomes top priority. And really, for the court system, that can be a very difficult thing, processing constantly changing directives when there's no new resource behind it. But we know that, there has been an increase in resources under President Macron. There's been nearly a 50% increase in funding for the Ministry of Justice. However, a lot of that gets pushed into prisons, prison accommodation. And so we know that court systems are underfunded. We know the local courthouse in Auch has all kinds of vacancies and shortages in terms of staff. So clearly there are difficulties. If what's coming from, the Elysee Palace is there is no resourcing problem, then clearly there's a problem in directing those resources, in trying to kind of underline where some of the political solutions to this are coming. Now, I think there are bigger social issues. That is what is being addressed. That is why people are gathering in front of courthouses tonight to protest against gender-based violence, against women and girls. Clearly, there are social problems around that. But I think at the moment, what we need to look at is where the difficulties are coming in, specifically related to the Minister of Justice, specifically related to the direction of resources. And that really, for me, is going to be the big issue that comes out of this. He said he will not resign. I think that may well be taken out of his hands at some point. Forced by this public pressure. Already, we've seen Yael Braun-Pivet, the President of the National Assembly, she's pushing forward a bill cross-signed by 100 deputies and from different parties, really trying to push for greater protections for women and girls. There's a lot of public anger here. And I think the Minister of Justice trying to say that it's the fault of magistrates is not landing. People are not buying this. People right across from the bottom up see this as a problem, how the state is directing resource. And so if there are issues there, then ultimately the buck has to stop with Darmanin.
The prosecutor of this case was on French TV a couple of days ago explaining that she didn't speak to the prime suspect because other things needed to be put into place. Now, that's perhaps procedural, and I don't see the logic in that, but that's just my opinion. But the top prosecutor of France, Remy Heitz, is saying, and this is on the record, everything needs to be sort of basically raised to ground level. It all needs to be basically cut right down, and this in the face of what is clearly a catastrophe. So when the top prosecutor of France is using such vocabulary about the situation, clearly they recognise they have a problem.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the issues here, there is, of course, the issue of speed. Why was this subject not questioned relating to those 2025 accusations? Why are these cases languishing without being formally investigated or processed? Is it about gridlock in the judicial system? We need more transparency. Why is there seemingly this divide as things are passed between different constituencies and jurisdictions within the legal system, even within France? And we also need to see transparency around whether or not the proper processes were followed in a priority case involving a child, for example. These are real issues that need answers. And clearly, as you said, it highlights problems around resource, as we've seen consistently. How is that being directed and coordinated against priorities? What are the priorities of the judicial system, and are they consistent and able to actually be enacted? But also, I think, ultimately, that issue of accountability. For many people, we've seen discussions from the Chamber of Agriculture even coming out in comment to this locally, saying, well, there's plenty of people to harass farmers for their kind of police to harass farmers around things, but none to actually process this. We've seen people complaining about traffic policing. What this does is it erodes public faith in the ability of the state to actually enact justice. And I think ultimately, when it comes down to these decisions, there needs to be accountability within those processes. So yes, it does need fundamentally to look at the processes, to look at the way the prosecution happens, to look at the communication between different forces and between different jurisdictions. But I think we also need to be careful not to enter into a period of judicial populism to try and turn against the magistrates. I think there is a danger in the line that is coming out of the Ministry of Justice saying there's deficiencies and it's the magistrates that are the problem. Actually, I think what's really important is that magistrates remain independent from politicians, that communication is clear and priorities are in line with what the state wants to do. But if there is a problem of resource and how that's being directed and confusion within a system as a result of that, then I think it's very clear that the buck has to stop at the top. But this should be investigated right throughout. There needs to be identification of where this went wrong, because at the end of the day, what we are dealing with is an extraordinary tragedy affecting a family that could happen again. That's what we're seeing. Are there other children in the system like this? That's the real kind of challenge. That's the real terror, I think, that has drawn people onto the streets tonight. And it's something I think the Minister of Justice has to make clear and take accountability for in order to give people confidence in that judiciary system.
Andrew Smith, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with us. Much appreciated. Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal studies at Queen Mary's in London. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon. But thank you for that analysis in what is a really horrific story which has shaken France, and clearly with every everybody around the world listen to this, it will resonate and strike fear into their hearts too. We will continue to bring you all developments of the story as we have it. And thanks again to Andrew Smith for joining us.